against the wall. Richard Williams strode in, his expensive Italian suit wrinkled, his face flushed with anger instead of the excitement Sarah had dreamed of seeing. His Rolex caught the harsh fluorescent lights as he checked the time with obvious irritation. Finally decided to show up, Sarah managed through gritted teeth, trying to hide the hurt in her voice. Don't start with me, Sarah. I was in the middle of closing the Morrison deal when you decided to go into labor. Richard's voice carried that familiar edge of blame that always made Sarah's stomach clench. Couldn't you have waited until Monday? Dr. Martinez looked up sharply from his position. Sir, your wife needs your support right now. She's been in labor for 18 hours. She needs to understand that some things are more important than her timing, Richard snapped, loosening his silk tie as if the very act of being in the delivery room was suffocating him. Sarah felt tears mixing with sweat on her cheeks. This was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. She had dreamed of this moment through countless failed fertility treatments, 3 devastating miscarriages, and years of Richard's growing coldness. In her fantasies, he would hold her hand, whisper words of encouragement, maybe even cry with joy when their baby finally arrived. The baby's crowning, Dr. Martinez announced, his voice filled with professional excitement. Sarah, give me everything you've got. Your daughter is almost here. Sarah bore down with all her strength, thinking of the tiny life about to enter the world, a life she had already loved fiercely for 9 months, talking to her belly every morning, playing Mozart while she worked in her garden, dreaming of the family they would finally become. It's a girl, Dr. Martinez lifted the crying infant, her tiny fists waving in the air. She's beautiful and healthy, perfect 10 fingers and 10 toes. Sarah reached out her trembling arms, tears streaming down her face. My baby girl, my Emma, the name they had chosen together during one of their rare peaceful moments. Sitting in the nursery, they had painted soft yellow because they wanted to be surprised, but Richard's voice cut through her joy like a blade. A girl. We talked about this. Sarah, I need a son. Someone to carry on the Williams name and take over the business. The words hit Sarah like physical blows. She had carried this child for 9 months, endured morning sickness that lasted all day, swollen ankles, sleepless nights, and a complicated pregnancy that had kept her on bed rest for the final month. And his first words were disappointment. Richard, please, Sarah whispered, still reaching for their daughter. Just hold her. Look at how perfect she is. No. Richard's voice was ice cold, colder than she had ever heard it. This is just another one of your failures. Sarah, first you can't get pregnant naturally, then you lose 3 babies, and now when you finally manage to carry one to term, it's not even what I asked for. Around them, the medical staff had gone silent, their faces shocked by the cruelty in Richard's words. Dr. Martinez held baby Emma protectively, his dark eyes flashing with something Sarah couldn't quite identify. Mr. Williams, Dr. Martinez said firmly, stepping slightly between Richard and Sarah. Your daughter is perfect and healthy. Your wife just went through 18 hours of labor to bring this beautiful child into the world. Perhaps you might want to, don't tell me about my wife, Richard snarled, his face reddening. And don't tell me about this disappointment. I specifically told Sarah I needed a male heir. Instead, she gives me another mouth to feed with no benefit to my legacy. Sarah felt something breaking inside her chest. Not just her heart, but something deeper. Some final thread of hope that had been holding their marriage together despite years of emotional abuse, financial control, and increasing isolation from everyone she had once cared about. That's what I think of your failures, Richard said quietly, his voice deadly calm. Both of them. Then he did something that would haunt Sarah forever and change the course of 3 lives in ways none of them could have imagined. The slap echoed through the delivery room like a gunshot. Sarah's head snapped to the side, her cheek burning from the force of Richard's open palm. The heart monitor that had been tracking her vital signs suddenly began racing as her blood pressure spiked dangerously. That's what I think of you and your useless daughter, Richard said, flexing his fingers as if the slap had hurt his hand. Dr. Martinez moved with surprising speed for a man in his 60s, placing himself directly between Richard and Sarah while still holding the crying newborn. Security, I need security in delivery room 3 immediately. The 2 nurses in the room had gone pale with shock. One of them was already reaching for the emergency button on the wall, while the other moved to check Sarah's vital signs. Sarah touched her burning cheek with trembling fingers, her newborn daughter crying in Dr. Martinez's protective arms. This wasn't how it was supposed to be. This wasn't the family she had dreamed of building during those long, lonely nights when Richard worked late or traveled for business. "Get out," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "What did you say?" Richard demanded, stepping closer despite Dr. Martinez's protective stance. "I said get out!" Sarah's voice rose to a shout that seemed to surprise even her. "Get out and don't come back. Get out and stay away from my daughter." Security guards appeared in the doorway within seconds, their hands already moving to their radios as they assessed the situation. The head of security, a woman named Captain Rodriguez, took one look at Sarah's reddening cheek and Richard's defensive posture and immediately understood what had happened. "Sir, I'm going to need you to come with us," Captain Rodriguez said in a voice that brooked no argument. "This is my wife and my child," Richard protested, but his bluster was already fading as he realized how his actions looked to the roomful of witnesses. "Sir, you just committed assault in front of multiple medical professionals. You can leave voluntarily with us, or we can call the police and you can leave in handcuffs. Your choice." As security escorted her millionaire ex-husband from the room, Sarah didn't know that Dr. Martinez, the man now gently placing her daughter in her arms, would soon reveal a secret that would change everything she thought she knew about her life, her family, and her future. The door closed behind Richard with a soft click, and suddenly the room felt peaceful despite everything that had just happened. Dr. Martinez adjusted baby Emma in Sarah's arms, his hands gentle and sure. "He's gone," Dr. Martinez said softly. "And Sarah, I want you to know something. What just happened here, that was not about you or your beautiful daughter. That was about a small, cruel man who just revealed his true character to a room full of people who will never forget it." Sarah looked down at Emma's perfect face, her daughter's crying gradually subsiding as she settled against her mother's chest. Despite the burning in her cheek and the chaos in her heart, Sarah felt something unexpected relief. For the first time in 15 years of marriage, she didn't have to apologize for existing. 3 hours later, Sarah sat in her private room on the maternity ward, little Emma sleeping peacefully in her arms. The bruise on her cheek had darkened to a deep purple, and every time she touched it, she felt fresh waves of humiliation mixed with something she was slowly recognizing as liberation. The nursing staff had been extraordinarily kind, bringing her ice packs and gentle words of support. Captain Rodriguez had stopped by to let her know that hospital security footage had captured everything, and that charges could be filed if Sarah chose to pursue them. But mostly, Sarah just wanted to hold her daughter and figure out what came next. A gentle knock interrupted her thoughts. "Come in," she called softly, careful not to wake Emma. Dr. Martinez entered, but something about him seemed different. He had changed out of his scrubs into an expensive-looking charcoal suit that fit him perfectly. His posture seemed more formal, more commanding, and when he moved, there was an understated confidence that spoke of power and authority. "How are you feeling, Sarah?" His accent seemed less pronounced now, more refined, as if he had been unconsciously code-switching during the delivery. "Like my world just fell apart," she admitted, then quickly added, "Dr. Martinez, I'm so sorry about what happened in there. Richard isn't usually—" She stopped herself, realizing that was a lie. Richard was exactly like that. She had just become an expert at hiding it. "Actually, he is usually like that. Isn't he?" Dr. Martinez pulled up the visitor's chair beside her bed, sitting down with the careful grace of someone accustomed to being in charge. "Sarah, may I speak freely?" She nodded, adjusting Emma in her arms and wondering why this conversation felt different from the typical doctor-patient interactions she was used to. "I've been watching you for months through your prenatal visits. The way you flinch when your phone rings. The way you apologize for everything, even things that aren't your fault. The way you try to explain away bruises that appear and disappear between appointments." Sarah's throat tightened. No one had ever called out the reality of her marriage so directly. "I don't know what you mean. Your husband hits you regularly, doesn't he? Today wasn't the first time." Dr. Martinez's voice was gentle but unwavering. And I know something about abuse because I grew up watching it destroy my mother. I recognize the signs because I lived with them every day for the first 18 years of my life. The words hung in the air like an accusation Sarah couldn't deny. She looked down at Emma's perfect tiny face, unable to meet the doctor's eyes. "It's complicated," she whispered. "No, Sarah, it's not complicated. It's abuse." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, his dark eyes intense but kind. "And what makes it worse is that you've been conditioned to believe you deserve it, that it's somehow your fault, that if you could just be better or stronger or more perfect, it would stop." Sarah felt tears starting again. This stranger was describing her life with an accuracy that was both terrifying and oddly comforting. "You don't understand. Richard controls everything. The house, the money, the cars. I don't even have access to our bank accounts. If I leave, where would Emma and I go? How would we survive? How do you leave someone who controls everything, your money, your friends, your sense of who you are? How do you start over when you don't even remember who you were before Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, seeming to weigh his words carefully. When he spoke again, his voice carried a weight Sarah couldn't quite understand. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you months ago, but I wanted to be absolutely certain. I needed time to process what I suspected and to figure out the right way to handle it." He paused, running his hand through his silver hair in a gesture that struck Sarah as somehow familiar. "My name isn't just Dr. Eduardo Martinez. It's Dr. Eduardo Martinez Blackwell." The name hit Sarah like lightning. Everyone in New York knew that name. Blackwell Industries was one of the largest privately held companies in America, with interests in everything from real estate to technology to renewable energy. She had read about Eduardo Blackwell in Forbes magazine just last month, a feature article about billionaire philanthropists who were quietly changing the world. "That's impossible," she breathed, staring at this man who had just delivered her baby and was now claiming to be one of the richest people in America. 24 years ago, I had a relationship with a young woman named Margaret Thompson. She was 19. I was 25 and just starting medical school. We met at a coffee shop near Columbia, where I was working weekends to pay my tuition. Sarah's heart began to race for reasons she couldn't quite identify. Her mother's maiden name had been Thompson. Her mother had been 19 when Sarah was born, but her mother had died in a car accident when Sarah was 18. When Margaret told me she was pregnant, I begged her to marry me. I was ready to drop out of medical school, get multiple jobs, do whatever it took to support our family. But her parents, they thought I was just some poor kid from Mexico who was after their money. The room seemed to spin around Sarah. "No," she whispered. But even as she said it, pieces were clicking into place. Her mother's mysterious past that she had never talked about. The way Margaret had always changed the subject when Sarah asked about her father. The secret phone calls that stopped abruptly when Sarah entered the room. They paid her $5,000 to disappear, told her they would disown her if she ever contacted me again, and that they would make sure I never became a doctor if she didn't cooperate. She took the money and vanished. I spent years trying to find her, but she had changed her name, gotten married to someone else. Here, Margaret Thompson became Margaret Williams when she married your stepfather. She told him you were his daughter. You were 3 years old at the time, just a little girl who needed a father figure. Sarah felt like she was drowning. "You're saying I'm your father. Sarah, I've been looking for you for 24 years. Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, making soft baby sounds that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden silence. Dr. Martinez, her father, looked at his granddaughter with tears in his eyes that he was trying hard to control. "I knew the moment you walked into my office 6 months ago for your first prenatal appointment. You have your mother's eyes and her smile, but you have my hands and my stubborn chin. See?" He held up his hands next to hers. The similarity was undeniable, the same long fingers, the same square palms, even the same small scar on the index finger from a childhood accident. "Why didn't you say anything before?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. "I needed to be absolutely certain. I had DNA testing done on some routine blood work during your second visit. The results came back 3 months ago." Eduardo reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded paper. "Sarah Thompson Williams, you are my daughter, and this beautiful little girl is my granddaughter." Sarah felt the world shifting beneath her like an earthquake. Her whole life had been built on lies. But maybe, for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. "What does this mean?" she asked, looking between the DNA test results and this man who was apparently her father. Eduardo reached into his jacket again and pulled out a business card. But this wasn't a medical card. It was heavy, cream-colored cardstock with gold embossing that read, Eduardo Martinez Blackwell, Chief Executive Officer, Blackwell Industries. "It means you never have to be afraid of Richard Williams again," he said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to wielding real power. "It means you have family who will protect you and Emma. And it means that the life you thought you were trapped in was just the prologue to the story you're really meant to live." Sarah stared at the business card, trying to process the magnitude of what she was learning. Her millionaire ex-husband had just revealed himself to be an abusive monster, and the doctor who delivered her baby had just revealed himself to be her billionaire father. Emma made a contented sound in her sleep, and Sarah looked down at her daughter with wonder. This little girl would never know what it felt like to be powerless, to be trapped, to believe she deserved less than everything good the world had to offer. "Eduardo," Sarah said, testing the name on her tongue. "Dad." "What happens now?" Eduardo smiled, and for the first time, Sarah could see her own smile reflected back at her. "Now, my dear daughter, we go home, and we start building the life you and Emma deserve." The next morning, Sarah stared out the window of the private car Eduardo had sent for her. She was being discharged from the hospital, but instead of going home to the mansion in Westchester that she shared with Richard, she was heading to a penthouse apartment in Manhattan that Eduardo kept for out-of-town guests. The transition felt surreal. 24 hours ago, she had been Sarah Williams, trapped wife of a moderately successful real estate developer. Now she was apparently Sarah Martinez, daughter of one of the richest men in America, with access to resources she couldn't even begin to comprehend. Mrs. Williams, the driver, a kind-faced man named James, glanced at her in the rearview mirror. "Mr. Blackwell wanted me to let you know that everything's been prepared for you and the baby. Nursery supplies, clothing, whatever you need. If there's anything specific you'd like, just let me know." Sarah adjusted Emma in her arms, marveling at how peaceful her daughter looked despite the chaos surrounding her birth. "James, can I ask you something?" "Of course, ma'am." "How long have you worked for Mr. Blackwell?" 15 years now. He's a good man, Mrs. Williams. Tough in business, but fair. Loyal to the people who matter to him. And he's been talking about finding you for as long as I've known him." James navigated the morning traffic with practiced ease, pointing out landmarks as they drove into Manhattan. "He had private investigators working your case for years. Never gave up hope that someday he'd find you and your mother." The car pulled up to a gleaming glass tower on the Upper East Side. The doorman, apparently expecting them, hurried over to help with Sarah's bags, which weren't many since she had refused to take anything from the house in Westchester except Emma's clothes and a few personal items. "Welcome home, Miss Blackwell," the doorman said with a warm smile that made Sarah's heart skip a beat. Miss Blackwell. Sarah had never heard those words before, but they sent a strange thrill through her. Not Mrs. Williams, not someone defined by her marriage to a man who treated her like property, but Miss Blackwell, a person in her own right with her own identity and power. The penthouse elevator opened directly into the apartment, and Sarah stepped out with a gasp that made Emma stir in her arms. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of Central Park, the trees just beginning to show their autumn colors. The space was elegantly furnished, but felt warm and welcoming. Nothing like the cold showcase that Richard had preferred for their home. "Sarah." Eduardo appeared from what looked like a home office, his face lighting up at the sight of her and Emma. He was dressed casually in dark jeans and a white button-down shirt, looking more like someone's favorite uncle than one of the most powerful men in America. "How are you feeling? How's my granddaughter?" "We're both fine," Sarah said, though she felt anything but fine. The events of the past day kept hitting her in waves. The violence of Richard's reaction, the revelation about Eduardo's identity, the complete upheaval of everything she thought she knew about her life. "Eduardo, this is all so overwhelming. Yesterday, I didn't even know you existed. And now you're discovering that your life can be completely different than what you thought possible?" Eduardo gently touched Emma's tiny hand with one finger, his expression soft with wonder. I know it's a lot to process, Sarah, but I need you to understand something fundamental. You don't have to go back to him, ever. You don't have to be afraid anymore. Sarah sank into one of the plush armchairs, Emma cradled against her chest. It's not that simple. Eduardo, Richard won't just let me go. He's used to getting what he wants, and he doesn't handle rejection well. When I don't come home today, when I don't answer his calls, he's going to escalate. Eduardo's expression hardened slightly. Richard Williams is worth about $50 million, most of it tied up in real estate and investments that could disappear overnight if the right pressure were applied. He paused, meeting Sarah's eyes directly. I'm worth $15 billion in liquid assets alone. The numbers were so large Sarah couldn't quite comprehend them. The difference between 50 million and 15 billion was like the difference between a puddle and an ocean. I'm not trying to intimidate you with money, Eduardo continued, settling into the chair across from her. I'm trying to show you that you have options now. Real options. The kind of options that come with real power. Sarah's phone, which had been mercifully quiet during the drive from the hospital, suddenly erupted with Richard's ringtone. She looked at the screen and felt her stomach clench with familiar fear, a Pavlovian response developed over years of walking on eggshells. Don't answer it, Eduardo said quietly, his voice carrying the kind of calm authority that came from never having to raise it to be heard. But if I don't, he'll just get angrier. And when he gets angry, Sarah, look at me. Eduardo's voice was firm but gentle. You are not responsible for managing his emotions anymore. You are not responsible for preventing his anger or minimizing his reactions. That's what abusers do. They train you to believe that their feelings are your responsibility, that their violence is something you provoke, rather than something they choose. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Sarah stared at the screen, watching Richard's name flash over and over, and felt something shift inside her chest. For the first time in 15 years, she didn't feel the automatic compulsion to answer, to apologize, to try to make things better. He's going to keep calling, Sarah said, but her voice was steadier now. Then let's make sure he understands the new reality. Eduardo walked to his home office and returned with a cordless phone. James, please get Michael Harrison on the line. Within minutes, Eduardo was speaking to someone in a tone that was polite, but carried undertones of absolute authority. Michael, I need you to contact Richard Williams immediately. Yes, the real estate developer. Tell him that if he contacts my daughter again by phone, text, email, or in person, I will personally destroy his business and ensure he spends the next decade in litigation. Sarah listened in amazement as her father, the words still felt foreign, but increasingly right, calmly explained that she would be filing for divorce immediately, that any harassment would result in swift legal action, and that Richard would do well to remember that crossing the Blackwell family was a career-ending mistake. That's right. Michael, my daughter, Eduardo continued. No, this isn't a negotiation. This is a statement of fact. Mr. Williams has 48 hours to process this information and adjust his behavior accordingly. When Eduardo hung up, Sarah's phone had finally stopped ringing. Is it really that simple? She asked, feeling like she was watching someone perform magic. Power usually is simple. Sarah, the complicated part is learning when and how to use it responsibly. Eduardo sat down across from her again. But there's something else we need to discuss. Something about your future and Emma's future. What do you mean, Sarah? You're my only child. When I die, Blackwell Industries, all of it will be yours. But I don't want to wait until I'm dead to share my life with you. I want to be part of raising Emma, and I want you to be part of the work that gives my life meaning. Eduardo leaned forward, his eyes bright with excitement. How would you feel about becoming the vice president of the Blackwell Foundation? It's our charitable arm. We give away $50 million a year to causes that matter: education, healthcare, women's shelters, environmental protection. The room seemed to tilt around Sarah, vice president of a foundation that gave away more money in a year than Richard was worth in total. I don't know anything about running a foundation, she whispered. You'll learn. And Sarah, you'll be brilliant at it. I can tell already you have your mother's heart for helping people, and my stubborn streak when it comes to getting things done. It's a powerful combination. Emma made a soft sound in her sleep, and both adults looked down at her with wonder. She was so tiny, so perfect, so completely unaware that her life had just changed in ways that would affect her forever. "She'll never want for anything," Eduardo said quietly. "Education, opportunities, the freedom to choose her own path based on her interests and talents rather than her gender or her circumstances. Everything I couldn't give you." For the first time since Emma's birth, Sarah felt something she had almost forgotten existed: hope. Not the desperate, clinging hope she had lived on during her marriage. Hope that Richard would change, that things would get better, that maybe this time would be different. This was something bigger and more solid. This was hope backed by power, by resources, by family who chose to love and protect each other. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Eduardo smiled, and she could see her own determination reflected in his expression. "Now we start building the life you and Emma deserve. And if Richard Williams wants to fight that, he's about to learn what it means to take on the wrong family." Outside the windows, New York City stretched out below them, full of possibility and promise. Sarah was beginning to understand that she wasn't just escaping from something, she was stepping into something magnificent. Across town in his glass-walled office overlooking the Hudson River, Richard Williams was learning what it felt like to be afraid. The call from Michael Harrison had been brief but devastating. Eduardo Martinez Blackwell. The Eduardo Martinez Blackwell. And somehow his mousy, controllable wife Sarah was connected to him. Richard had built his $50 million empire by being smarter and more ruthless than everyone else. He had married Sarah precisely because she seemed perfect for his needs, beautiful enough to impress his clients and business partners, educated enough to hold conversations at charity galas, and submissive enough to never challenge his authority or question his decisions. But in the past 24 hours, she had somehow transformed into something he didn't recognize. The Sarah he knew would have come crawling back after their fight at the hospital, apologizing and begging for forgiveness. She certainly wouldn't have ignored 17 phone calls and disappeared with their newborn daughter. "Get me everything you can find on Sarah's family history," Richard barked into his phone to his private investigator, a man named Stevens who specialized in finding leverage on business rivals. "I want to know how she's connected to Blackwell Industries. I want birth certificates, school records, medical records, everything. And I want it today." Richard paced behind his desk, his expensive Italian leather shoes silent on the thick Persian rug. Through his office windows, he could see the construction cranes working on his latest development project, a luxury residential complex that would net him $15 million in profit if everything went according to plan. But nothing was going according to plan anymore. His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Mr. Williams, there's a woman here to see you. She says it's about your wife. She doesn't have an appointment, but she seems quite insistent." "Send her in," Richard said, hoping this might be Sarah coming to her senses. The woman who entered was elegant in a way that money couldn't buy, probably in her early 60s, with perfectly styled silver hair and the kind of understated jewelry that cost more than most people's cars. She moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the most powerful person in any room. "Mr. Williams, I'm Margaret Thompson Chen. I believe you know my daughter, Sarah." Richard's mind raced. Sarah had never mentioned a mother named Margaret. According to what Sarah had told him, her mother was dead, had died in a car accident when Sarah was 18. Her stepfather had raised her from the time she was 3. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been some mistake. Sarah's mother died when she was young." Margaret smiled, but it wasn't a pleasant expression. It was the smile of a predator who had just cornered her prey. "That's what I told her. Yes, sometimes lies become necessary to protect the people we love, even when those lies cause their own kind of damage." She sat down without being invited, crossing her legs elegantly and studying Richard with the kind of calm assessment usually reserved for laboratory specimens. "You see, Mr. Williams, 24 years ago, I made a terrible mistake. I was young and scared, and I let my parents convince me to give up the man I loved because they thought he wasn't good enough for our family." Richard felt a cold dread building in his stomach like ice water spreading through his veins. "The man I loved was Eduardo Martinez. He's worth considerably more now than he was then. But even 24 years ago, my parents underestimated his potential. It's a mistake I've regretted every day since." "What do you want?" Richard asked, his voice tight with barely controlled panic. "I want to make amends for the damage I've done. You see, I've been watching Sarah for years, following her life from a distance, making sure she was safe and happy, and I've seen what you've done to her." Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice never rising above conversational level, but somehow becoming more intimidating. "I know about the bruises, Mr. Williams. I know about the financial control, the isolation from friends and family, the systematic destruction of her self-esteem. I know about the emotional abuse that's made my bright, wonderful daughter believe she's worthless. You don't know anything about my marriage. I know enough. I know that you've been hitting my daughter for years. I know that you struck her in a hospital delivery room in front of witnesses. I know that you called your newborn baby a failure." Margaret's voice remained perfectly controlled, but her eyes were hard as diamonds. "And now that Eduardo has found her, now that she knows who her real father is, I finally have the chance to protect her the way I should have been protecting her all along." Richard stood up abruptly, his chair rolling backward into the credenza behind his desk. "Get out of my office." "Oh, I'll leave. But first, let me give you some friendly advice." Margaret's voice was steel-wrapped in silk, the tone of someone delivering an ultimatum disguised as a suggestion. "Don't fight this divorce, Mr. Williams. Don't try to take custody of that baby. Don't make any moves against Sarah or Eduardo or anyone in the Blackwell family." "Are you threatening me? I'm warning you. You see, I married very well the second time around. My husband, Dr. James Chen, is one of the most prominent surgeons in the city. We move in the same social circles as the Blackwell family, the same charity boards, the same country clubs where reputation is everything and scandal spreads faster than wildfire." Margaret stood gracefully, smoothing her skirt with hands that didn't shake. "It would be such a shame if word got out about how Richard Williams treats his wife, how he struck a woman who had just given birth to his child, how he called his newborn daughter a failure in front of a room full of medical professionals." The blood drained from Richard's face. "No one would believe. The entire delivery room staff witnessed it, Mr. Williams, doctors, nurses, security guards, all upstanding professionals with sterling reputations and no reason to lie." Margaret moved toward the door, then turned back with that same predatory smile. "Plus, of course, there's the security footage, high-definition video with excellent audio quality." She paused at the door, her hand on the handle. "Sign the divorce papers when they arrive. Accept whatever settlement Sarah's lawyers offer. Pay your child support on time, and disappear from her life quietly and permanently. Do that, and this all stays private between the people who were already there. Fight it." Margaret shrugged elegantly. "Well, let's just say that the society pages can be very unforgiving, and my husband and I know an awful lot of people who write for them." After she left, Richard slumped into his chair, his hands shaking as he reached for the bottle of scotch he kept in his desk drawer. He had underestimated Sarah, and now he was paying the price. But Richard Williams hadn't built an empire by giving up at the first sign of trouble. He picked up his phone and dialed his lawyer. "Marcus, it's Richard. I need you to file an emergency custody petition immediately." "Yes, for the baby. Tonight, if possible." "Richard, are you sure that's wise? If what you told me about the hospital incident is true?" "I don't care about the hospital. I'm not going to let some billionaire steal my family just because he's got more money than me. Sarah is obviously having some kind of mental breakdown, probably postpartum depression. She's been manipulated by this man who claims to be her father. Any reasonable judge will see that the baby belongs with her real family." "What grounds are you planning to claim?" Richard smiled grimly. "Mental instability, abandonment of the marital home, kidnapping of a minor child. Take your pick. The point is to get Emma back and force Sarah to come home where she belongs." As he hung up the phone, Richard felt some of his confidence returning. Eduardo Martinez Blackwell might have billions of dollars, but Richard had something more powerful: the legal system. And in family court, money didn't always win. Sometimes the biological father who could present himself as the stable, concerned parent had the advantage. He opened his laptop and began making notes for his custody petition. By tomorrow morning, he would have filed papers that would bring Sarah and Emma home where they belonged. And if Eduardo Blackwell wanted to fight him for his own family, Richard would show him what happened when outsiders tried to interfere with a man's marriage. This was far from over. He's filed for what? Sarah's voice rose in disbelief as she sat in the elegant conference room of Harrison, Burke and Associates, Manhattan's most prestigious family law firm. Michael Harrison, Eduardo's longtime attorney and one of the most respected lawyers in New York, slid the legal documents across the polished mahogany table. Emergency custody petition. He's claiming that you're mentally unstable due to postpartum depression and that Emma is in immediate danger. Sarah felt the blood drain from her face as she scanned the documents. Emma was sleeping peacefully in her car seat beside Sarah's chair, completely unaware that her father was trying to take her away from the only parent who had ever truly wanted her. But that's insane. I've never had postpartum depression. I'm fine. I'm better than I've been in years. Richard is also claiming that you've been kidnapped by Eduardo and are being held against your will. Michael continued, his voice grim as he turned through the pages of legal filing. He's painted a picture of you as a vulnerable new mother who's been manipulated by a billionaire with questionable motives. Eduardo, who had been pacing behind Sarah's chair like a caged lion, slammed his hand on the conference table hard enough to make the water glasses jump. That son of a… Eduardo, Sarah said quietly, glancing at Emma. Language. The baby. Even in her panic, her maternal instincts were kicking in. Eduardo looked at his 3-day-old granddaughter and immediately softened, his expression shifting from rage to protectiveness. Sorry, sweetheart, but Sarah, this is exactly what abusers do when they lose control. When they can't manipulate you directly anymore, they use the legal system as another weapon. They know exactly which buttons to push to make you look unstable or unfit. Michael nodded grimly. The good news is that emergency custody petitions require evidence of immediate danger to the child. Richard's filing is mostly accusations without substantial proof. He's banking on the fact that judges take any allegations involving newborns very seriously. What's the bad news? Sarah asked, though she was afraid to hear the answer. The bad news is that family court judges err on the side of caution when it comes to infant safety. They'll likely order a temporary custody evaluation, which means social workers, psychological evaluations, home visits, and possibly supervised visitation until we can prove Richard's claims are false. Sarah felt tears starting, hot and angry. They'll take Emma away from me. Not necessarily, Michael said quickly, but there will probably be restrictions. Court-appointed monitors, scheduled visitation, documentation requirements. The goal is to maintain the status quo while the investigation proceeds. How long will that take? Eduardo asked, his jaw clenched with the effort of controlling his temper. Could be weeks, could be months. Family court moves slowly, especially when there are serious allegations involved. Have you ever felt like the system was designed to protect everyone except you? Like the very institutions that should help were being turned into weapons against you? Sarah looked down at Emma's perfect sleeping face, thinking about all the years she had struggled with fertility, the 3 miscarriages that had broken her heart, the joy she had felt when she finally held her healthy daughter. The thought of being separated from Emma, even temporarily, was unbearable. There has to be something we can do, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Michael hesitated, exchanging a glance with Eduardo. There is one option, but it's risky and it will make this whole situation very public very quickly. What kind of option? Eduardo asked. We could file a counter petition claiming that Richard is the danger to the child, document the abuse, the violence, his rejection of Emma after her birth, make this about his fitness as a parent rather than Sarah's mental state. But, Sarah prompted, sensing there was more, but it means this becomes a very public, very ugly fight. Richard will fight back with everything he's got. He'll drag Sarah's name through the mud, make accusations about her mental state, probably try to claim that her relationship with you, Eduardo, is somehow inappropriate or financially motivated. Sarah felt trapped between 2 terrible choices. If she did nothing, Richard might take Emma away using lies and manipulation. If she fought back, her private life would become public entertainment for strangers who didn't know or care about the truth. What would you do? Michael, if this were your daughter and granddaughter. Michael was quiet for a long moment, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. I'd fight, but I'd fight smart, and I'd make sure Richard Williams regretted ever crossing the Blackwell family. A knock on the conference room door interrupted them. Michael's assistant entered with a concerned expression that immediately put everyone on edge. "Mr. Harrison, there are reporters outside, about a dozen of them, with cameras and news vans. Someone leaked the custody story to the press." Sarah's heart sank as she realized her quiet life was over forever. "How did they find out so fast?" Eduardo's expression darkened with understanding. "Richard, he called the press himself. He's trying to control the narrative, make himself look like the concerned father fighting to protect his child from an unstable mother and her manipulative billionaire father." Through the conference room's floor-to-ceiling windows, they could see news vans lining the street below. Reporters were setting up cameras and checking equipment, preparing for what they expected would be a juicy story about wealth, family drama, and custody battles. "What do we do now?" Sarah asked, feeling overwhelmed by the thought of strangers judging her life based on whatever narrative Richard chose to spin. Michael smiled grimly, and Sarah caught a glimpse of why Eduardo had chosen him as his attorney. "Now we show Richard Williams what happens when you pick a fight with the wrong family. Eduardo, do you still have contacts at the Times, several, and at the Post, the Journal, and most of the major television networks? Good, because I think it's time the public heard the real story about Richard Williams and how he treats his wife. If he wants to play this game in public, we're going to make sure the public gets all the facts." Sarah looked between her father and the lawyer, realizing she was watching masters of power at work. These weren't just wealthy men throwing money around, they were strategists who understood how to use information, relationships, and influence to protect the people they cared about. "You really think we can win this?" she asked. Eduardo came around the table and gently squeezed her shoulder. "Sarah, I've been fighting battles longer than you've been alive. I've taken on governments, corporations, and competitors who thought they could intimidate me. Richard Williams is about to learn that money is just the beginning of power. Real power is having the right allies, the right information, and the willingness to use both when someone threatens your family." Emma stirred in her car seat, making soft baby sounds that drew everyone's attention to her innocent face. Sarah reached down to comfort her daughter, stroking her tiny hand with one finger. "Don't worry, baby girl," she whispered. "Mommy's going to make sure you're safe. We all are." Outside, the reporters were setting up for what they expected to be a standard custody battle between a millionaire and his wife. They had no idea they were about to witness the full power of the Blackwell Empire unleashed in defense of family. The war had begun, but Sarah was no longer fighting alone. "Good evening. I'm Diana Walsh with Channel 7 News. Tonight, a shocking story of wealth, power, and family secrets that reads like something out of a soap opera." Sarah sat in Eduardo's penthouse living room, Emma sleeping in her arms, watching her life become public entertainment. On the massive flat-screen television, her wedding photo to Richard appeared alongside headlines that made her stomach churn. "Custody battle rocks New York elite," and "Billionaire claims millionaire's wife as long-lost daughter." "Turn it off," Eduardo said from across the room, where he was pacing like a caged animal, his phone buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, business associates, and friends who had seen the news. "No," Sarah said quietly, her voice steadier than she felt. "I need to see what they're saying about us. I need to know what Emma will read about her family someday." The news report continued with a statement from Richard's lawyer that painted him as the reasonable party. "Mr. Williams is deeply concerned about his wife's mental state following the birth of their daughter. Sarah has been manipulated by individuals seeking to exploit her vulnerability during this difficult time." Sarah felt sick watching Richard on screen, looking perfectly respectable in his expensive suit, projecting the image of a concerned father just trying to protect his child. He had always been good at managing his public image, at presenting himself as successful and trustworthy while hiding the cruel reality behind closed doors. Then the reporter's tone shifted in a way that made Sarah sit up straighter. "However, Channel 7 News has obtained exclusive hospital records and witness statements that paint a very different picture of the Williams marriage." Sarah looked up sharply at Eduardo, who was now smiling grimly. "You didn't waste any time," she said. "When someone attacks my family, I respond quickly and decisively," Eduardo replied. "Margaret knows people, and those people know other people. The truth has a way of spreading when the right people want it to spread." Hospital security footage from the day of the baby's birth shows Mr. Williams striking his wife in the delivery room just minutes after their daughter was born. The reporter continued. The grainy security video played on screen, and even without sound, the violence was clear and shocking. Richard's hand making contact with Sarah's face, her head snapping to the side, the horrified reactions of the medical staff, Emma stirring against her father's shoulder as if she could sense the tension in the room. Additionally, multiple hospital employees have confirmed that Mr. Williams rejected his newborn daughter, calling her a failure and stating that he needed a son to carry on his legacy. Sarah watched Richard's carefully crafted image crumble in real time. The phone in the penthouse started ringing immediately, and Eduardo moved to answer it. "Don't take any media calls," he advised Sarah. "Michael's office is handling all press inquiries. We want to control the message." But the caller ID showed it was Margaret, and Eduardo accepted the call, putting it on speaker so Sarah could hear. "Sarah, honey, are you watching the news?" Margaret's voice carried a mixture of satisfaction and concern. "Yes, Mom," Sarah said, the words still feeling strange but increasingly natural. "Did you really give them the hospital footage?" Margaret's laugh was musical but had an edge to it. "Darling, I've been friends with Diana Walsh for 20 years. We serve on 3 charity boards together. Our husbands play golf at the same club, and we've supported each other through divorces, deaths, and various scandals. When she called asking about the custody story, I simply made sure she had all the facts." Eduardo took the phone off speaker. "Margaret, you're brilliant, but is Sarah ready for what comes next because Richard isn't going to take this quietly?" "You're right," Margaret said, and Sarah could hear the worry creeping into her voice. "Richard's going to be furious, humiliated. Men like him don't handle public embarrassment well, especially when it threatens their business reputation." As if summoned by their conversation, Sarah's personal phone began buzzing with a call from Richard. She stared at the screen, paralyzed by years of conditioning that told her to answer when he called, no matter what. "Answer it," Eduardo said firmly. "But put it on speaker. I want to hear what he has to say, and I want witnesses to whatever threats he makes." Sarah's hand trembled as she accepted the call and activated the speaker function. "You think you're clever?" Richard's voice was pure venom, loaded with rage and humiliation. "You think your billionaire daddy can protect you from the consequences of what you've done?" "Richard, please," Sarah began, but he cut her off immediately. "Shut up, just shut up and listen to me for once in your pathetic life. You've embarrassed me in front of the entire city, made me look like some kind of monster on television." "You are a monster," Sarah said, surprising herself with the steadiness in her voice. "You hit me, Richard, in front of doctors and nurses. You called our baby a failure. She is a failure just like her mother. 15 years I wasted on you. And what do I have to show for it? A wife who can't give me a son and runs away the first time things get difficult." Eduardo stepped closer to the phone, his presence giving Sarah strength she didn't know she possessed. "And now you're going to pay for this betrayal," Richard continued, his voice escalating to near shouting. "Both of you. I'm going to drag this custody fight out for years. I'm going to make sure every detail of your pathetic life becomes public knowledge. I'm going to destroy your reputation and your precious foundation. I'm going to—" "Richard," Eduardo's voice cut through the rant like ice, quiet but carrying absolute authority. "This is Eduardo Martinez Blackwell." The line went completely silent except for the sound of Richard's heavy breathing. "I'm going to give you one chance to end this quietly and walk away with some dignity intact." Eduardo continued in that same calm, deadly tone. "Drop the custody petition. Agree to a reasonable divorce settlement. Stay away from my daughter and granddaughter. Do that, and you can rebuild your life and your business without interference." "Go to hell," Richard snarled, but there was less conviction in his voice now. "Wrong answer." Eduardo's voice remained perfectly calm, which somehow made it more frightening. "You see, Richard, I've spent the last few hours making some phone calls to the bank that holds your primary construction loan, to the city planning commission that's reviewing your Harbor Point development project, to the investors in your pension fund syndication." Sarah could hear Richard's breathing getting heavier and more agitated. You have 24 hours to withdraw your legal filings and accept the divorce terms my lawyers will send you. If you don't, I will systematically dismantle everything you've built, your business, your reputation, your financial future, all of it. You can't do that. There are laws. I'm not talking about doing anything illegal. Richard, I'm talking about the perfectly legal consequences of your choices. Ask Marcus Hendricks about it. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. How do you know about Marcus? Marcus Hendricks was your biggest investor until about an hour ago. He just pulled out of your Harbor Point project after I shared some concerns about your character and judgment. $42 million in financing. Gone. The line went dead. Richard had hung up. Sarah stared at the phone, then at Eduardo. Did you really just destroy a $40 million real estate deal in one phone call? I ended a business relationship between someone I know and someone who threatened my family, Eduardo said calmly. Richard just learned what happens when someone with real power decides to use it to protect the people they love. On the television, the news had moved to the weather forecast, but Sarah knew the damage was done. By tomorrow morning, everyone in New York would know the truth about Richard Williams and how he treated his wife and newborn daughter. Is it over? She asked, hardly daring to hope. Eduardo looked at his granddaughter, sleeping peacefully despite the chaos swirling around her birth. It's just beginning, sweetheart. But now Richard knows what he's really fighting against, and I don't think he's going to like his odds. Emma made a soft sound in her sleep, and Sarah gently adjusted her position. Her daughter would grow up in a world where she was protected, valued, and loved unconditionally. That was worth any amount of public scrutiny or media attention. The storm was far from over, but for the first time since this nightmare began, Sarah felt like she was on the winning side. The Blackwell Industries headquarters occupied 43 floors of prime Manhattan real estate, and this morning it hummed with the focused energy of a military operation. Sarah sat in Eduardo's corner office on the 43rd floor, Emma sleeping in a portable crib that had appeared overnight, watching her father coordinate what could only be described as corporate warfare. Jenkins, I want the Harbor Point permits held up in review indefinitely. Eduardo spoke into his phone while simultaneously reviewing documents spread across his massive mahogany desk. Environmental concerns, traffic impact studies, neighborhood character assessments, whatever it takes to slow down the approval process. No, Jenkins. Indefinitely means indefinitely. Sarah marveled at the efficiency of it all. In less than 24 hours, Eduardo had mobilized an entire network of business contacts, political connections, and financial leverage points that she hadn't even known existed. She was beginning to understand that her father's power went far beyond money. He had spent decades building relationships and earning influence that could be activated when necessary. Michael Harrison appeared in the doorway, his usually calm demeanor replaced by something that looked almost like excitement. Eduardo, we've got news. Richard's lawyer called 20 minutes ago. He wants to negotiate. Already? Sarah looked up from where she'd been reading about the Blackwell Foundation's annual report. But you said this could take months. Michael grinned, the expression transforming his serious face. That was before your father reminded half of New York why they don't cross the Blackwell family. Richard's lost 3 major investors since yesterday. 2 bank loans are being called in for review, and the city council just announced they're investigating complaints about his construction practices. Eduardo ended his phone call and joined them, settling into one of the leather chairs arranged around a small conference table. What's he offering? Full custody to Sarah. Reasonable visitation rights for Richard. He keeps his current assets but pays child support and alimony according to state guidelines. And Eduardo's tone suggested there was more to the proposal. And he wants a guarantee that the business pressure stops immediately. He's hemorrhaging money by the hour, and his remaining investors are getting nervous about their exposure to his projects. Sarah looked between the 2 men. These masters of power and influence who were dismantling her millionaire ex-husband's empire with the efficiency of a surgical procedure. Is that enough? What if he changes his mind later? What if he decides to fight for custody when Emma's older? He won't, Eduardo said with absolute certainty, because he'll sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement that includes substantial financial penalties. If he ever harasses you or Emma again, if he violates the visitation terms, if he so much as speaks negatively about you in public, it'll cost him everything he has left. There was a knock on the office door, and Eduardo's assistant entered with an expression that immediately put everyone on alert. "Mr. Blackwell, there's a Mr. Williams here to see you. He doesn't have an appointment, but he's quite insistent. Security is with him." Sarah felt her stomach drop as familiar fear rushed through her system. "Richard's here in the building." "Send him in, Janet," Eduardo said calmly, his voice carrying no trace of concern. "But have security remain nearby, just in case Mr. Williams has trouble controlling his temper." Richard entered the office like a man walking to his own execution. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. Dark circles under his eyes suggested he hadn't slept much, if at all. He looked like a man who had spent the night watching his carefully constructed world collapse around him. "Eduardo, Sarah." His voice was tight with barely controlled anger, but there was something else underneath it, something that might have been fear. "Richard," Eduardo gestured to a chair with perfect politeness. "Please, sit down. We have a lot to discuss, and I'm sure you're anxious to resolve this situation quickly." "I'm not here to negotiate. I'm here to tell you both that you've made a terrible mistake." Richard remained standing, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Sarah instinctively moved closer to Emma's crib, her protective instincts kicking in even though she knew security was just outside the door. Even defeated and desperate, Richard still radiated a threatening energy that made her nervous. "Have we?" Eduardo's tone was conversational, but Sarah noticed his hand moving discreetly toward the panic button on his desk. "You think money solves everything? You think you can just wave your hand and make people disappear like they never mattered?" Richard's voice was getting louder, more agitated. "But I built my business from nothing. I've survived economic crashes, hostile takeovers, city politics that would have destroyed weaker men. I'm not going to be destroyed by some old man with a guilty conscience and more money than sense." "Richard," Sarah said quietly, finding her voice despite her fear, "just sign the papers. Take the deal. It's generous, and it lets you keep your dignity." "Generous?" Richard laughed, but there was no humor in it, only bitterness and rage. "Sarah, you have no idea what you've unleashed. This man isn't your father. He's a predator who's using you to feel better about abandoning your mother 24 years ago." Eduardo stood up slowly, his movements careful and controlled. "I think you should leave now." "Richard, before you say something, you'll regret even more than what you've already said." "Oh, I'm leaving, but not before I tell you both some hard truths that neither of you wants to hear." Richard turned to Sarah, his eyes filled with the kind of malicious satisfaction he got from hurting people. "You think this is some fairy tale that you're suddenly a princess because you found out daddy's rich? You're still the same pathetic woman who couldn't give me a son. The same failure who needed fertility treatments just to get pregnant at all. Sometimes the cruelest words come from people who once claimed to love us, but their cruelty says everything about them and nothing about us." Sarah felt the familiar sting of Richard's words, but something fundamental had changed in how she processed them. Instead of the crushing shame she usually felt, she found herself thinking clearly about what he was really doing, trying to hurt her because he was losing control and didn't know any other way to respond. "You're right about one thing, Richard," she said, standing up and moving to Eduardo's side. "I am the same woman who struggled with fertility, the same woman who wanted a family so desperately that I stayed with a man who hit me and called me worthless. But you know what else I am." Richard glared at her, clearly not expecting her to fight back. "I'm the woman who survived 18 hours of labor to bring our daughter into the world while you were making business deals. I'm the woman who loved you for 15 years despite your cruelty and abuse. I'm the woman who's strong enough to walk away from you and build a better life for Emma." Sarah moved closer to Eduardo, drawing strength from his presence. "And yes, I'm Eduardo Martinez Blackwell's daughter, which means Emma is his granddaughter, which means she'll grow up knowing she's loved, valued, and powerful enough to choose her own path in life." Richard's face contorted with rage and frustration. "You think, I think this conversation is over?" Eduardo interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to ending discussions when he chose to. "Security will escort you out. You have until 5 o'clock today to sign the agreement Michael's office will send over. After that, the offer expires and we proceed to trial." "Fine," Richard snarled, his composure finally cracking completely. "But don't think this is over. I'll find another way to hurt you both. I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of people you really are." As security escorted Richard from the office, Sarah realized she was trembling not with fear, but with adrenaline and something that felt remarkably like victory. For the first time in her marriage, she had stood up to Richard without backing down, without apologizing, without trying to minimize the damage he was causing. "Are you all right?" Eduardo asked gently, his hand on her shoulder. "Actually, yes, I think I really am." Sarah looked at Emma, still sleeping peacefully despite the chaos swirling around her. "Is he really going to sign?" Michael, who had remained diplomatically quiet throughout the confrontation, smiled with professional satisfaction. "Oh, he'll sign. His lawyer called again while he was up here making threats. 3 more investors just pulled out of his projects, and his primary lender is calling in their loan. Richard Williams is about 12 hours away from bankruptcy." Eduardo checked his watch, a gesture that somehow managed to convey both precision and inevitability. "In that case, I think it's time you met the rest of the Blackwell Foundation board. You start your new job on Monday. Monday, but Emma's only 4 days old. The foundation offices are on the 20th floor of this building. We have a full daycare facility, private nursing rooms, flexible scheduling, whatever you need to be both a mother and a professional. Emma can come to work with you every day if you want." Sarah looked around the office at the view of Central Park stretching out below them, at the family photos Eduardo had already placed on his desk, including one of her and Emma from the hospital, at the oil portrait of his late wife that hung behind his chair with a small brass plaque reading, "Maria Elena Martinez Blackwell, 1960-2019, beloved wife and partner." For the first time since Emma's birth, she felt like she was exactly where she belonged. "What will I be doing at the foundation?" she asked. "Changing lives," Eduardo said simply, "starting with your own." At exactly 4:57 p.m., Richard Williams walked into the conference room at Harrison, Burke and Associates, looking like a man attending his own funeral. His lawyer, Marcus Gold, followed behind carrying a thick folder of documents and wearing the resigned expression of someone who had spent the day explaining to his client why surrender was the only viable option. Sarah sat at the far end of the polished conference table with Emma sleeping in her arms, Eduardo on one side and Michael Harrison on the other. The contrast between the two sides of the table was stark. Sarah's team radiated calm confidence while Richard looked like he was barely holding himself together. "Mr. Williams," Michael said formally, his voice carrying the weight of legal finality, "are you prepared to sign the custody and divorce agreements as previously outlined?" Richard slumped into his chair, his expensive suit wrinkled and his usually perfect hair disheveled. "Do I have a choice?" "There's always a choice," Eduardo said quietly, his tone neutral but his meaning clear. "But some choices have consequences you can't live with." Marcus Gold opened his folder and spread the documents across the table with the efficiency of someone who had handled many similar capitulations. "My client agrees to all terms as specified. Full custody to Mrs. Williams, reasonable visitation rights for Mr. Williams, child support and alimony according to state guidelines, and the comprehensive non-disclosure provisions." Sarah watched Richard's face as Marcus read through the terms that would govern the rest of their lives. She was surprised to realize she felt almost sorry for him. Almost. The bruise on her cheek had faded to a yellowish green, but she could still feel the echo of his hand striking her face in that delivery room. "Richard," she said softly, her voice carrying none of the fear that had characterized their relationship for so many years. "The visitation schedule gives you every other weekend once Emma's older, plus alternating holidays. You don't have to disappear from her life completely." Richard looked up at her with something that might have been surprise. "After everything I've done to you, everything I've said, you still want me to be part of her life. I want Emma to have the chance to know her father, the real you, if that person still exists underneath all the anger and control." Sarah adjusted Emma in her arms, the baby's weight grounding her in the moment. "But only if you can learn to be the kind of father she deserves, one who values her for who she is, not who you want her to be." For a moment, Richard's carefully constructed mask slipped, and Sarah caught a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with 15 years ago, ambitious but not yet cruel, driven but not yet consumed by the need to control everything around him. But then his jaw tightened and the walls went back up. "Let's just get this over with," he muttered, reaching for the first document. The signing process took nearly an hour. Page after page of legal documents that officially ended Sarah's marriage and began Emma's new life as part of the Blackwell family. Child support that would ensure Emma never wanted for anything, calculated as a percentage of Richard's income that would motivate him to rebuild his business responsibly. Alimony that would give Sarah complete financial independence for the first time in her adult life, and the non-disclosure agreement that would keep Richard from ever publicly attacking Sarah or the Blackwell family. When the last signature was complete, Michael gathered all the documents with the satisfaction of a job well done. That concludes our business. Mr. Williams, you have 48 hours to vacate the marital home. Mrs. Williams will arrange to collect her personal belongings at a mutually convenient time. Actually, Sarah said, her voice surprising everyone at the table, I don't want anything from that house. Nothing except my photo albums and Emma's nursery furniture. Richard looked up sharply. Nothing, but there are antiques worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Jewelry, art, things you chose, things that made you happy. Sarah shifted Emma to her other arm, the baby stirring slightly but remaining asleep. I want to start fresh. Everything new, everything chosen by me for me and Emma. As Richard and his lawyer prepared to leave, he paused at the door, his hand on the handle. Sarah, for what it's worth, I'm sorry about the hospital, about hitting you. About all of it. Sarah met his eyes directly, no longer afraid of his anger or his disapproval. I know you are, Richard, but sorry doesn't undo the damage. Sorry doesn't erase the fear or rebuild the trust. And sorry doesn't guarantee it won't happen again. It won't. I swear to you on everything I have left. You swore to love and honor me too, in front of God and everyone we knew. Sarah's voice was sad but firm, filled with the wisdom that comes from finally understanding your own worth. I can't build Emma's life on your promises anymore. I have to build it on my own choices and the family that chooses to support those choices. After Richard left, the conference room felt lighter somehow, as if a dark cloud had finally lifted. Eduardo reached over and gently touched Emma's cheek with one finger. It's done, sweetheart. You're free. Free. Sarah repeated the word like she was tasting it for the first time. I'm not sure I remember what that feels like. Amerton Michael smiled, gathering the signed documents into a neat stack. You'll learn, and you'll have plenty of help along the way. Eduardo pulled out another folder from his briefcase. Speaking of which, there's one more document to sign today if you're ready. Sarah looked at him questioningly. Your employment contract with the Blackwell Foundation, starting salary is $300,000 per year, plus full benefits, plus a discretionary bonus based on foundation performance and your personal contributions to our mission. Sarah's eyes widened as she tried to process the number. 300,000. But I've never worked in philanthropy. I've never even had a real job outside the home. You've spent 15 years managing a household with a staff of 6, organizing charity events that raised millions of dollars, coordinating social functions for Richard's business associates. You've run fundraisers for the hospital, the Children's Museum, the animal shelter. Eduardo smiled with paternal pride. You've been doing foundation work your whole marriage. Sarah, you just weren't getting paid for it or getting credit for your accomplishments. But what if I'm terrible at it? What if I disappoint you? Then you'll learn from your mistakes and get better, just like everyone does. But Sarah, I've watched you organize events that raised hundreds of thousands of dollars for charity. I've seen how you connect with people, how you make them feel heard and valued and inspired to contribute to something bigger than themselves. That's not something you can teach in business school. It's something you're born with. Emma stirred in Sarah's arms, opening her eyes for the first time since the meeting began. She looked around the room with the unfocused gaze of a newborn, but when her eyes found Sarah's face, she seemed to focus with the intensity that babies reserve for the most important person in their world. Hi, baby girl, Sarah whispered, her voice filled with wonder and love. Mommy just signed some very important papers. Papers that mean you're going to grow up safe and loved and free to be whoever you want to be. Eduardo leaned over to look at his granddaughter, his face soft with the kind of love that transcends words. She's beautiful. Sarah, Margaret was right. She has your mother's eyes and my stubborn chin. Mom's coming to dinner tonight, Sarah said, still marveling at having a mother again after so many years of believing herself to be an orphan. She wants to meet Emma properly, and she wants to tell me more about why she left you all those years ago. Are you ready for that conversation? Sarah considered the question, taking inventory of how much her life had changed in just a few days. 24 hours ago, she had been trapped in an abusive marriage with no hope of escape and no resources to build a different life. Now she was divorced, financially independent, reunited with her father, about to start a meaningful career, and raising her daughter surrounded by family who chose each other every single day. "I'm ready for anything," she said, and for the first time in years, she meant it completely. Outside the conference room windows, the sun was setting over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Sarah could see people hurrying home from work, heading to dinner with loved ones, living their lives with the freedom she was only now beginning to understand. Tomorrow, she would be one of them, a working mother building a future for her daughter based on her own choices and values. "Thank you," she said to Eduardo, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything, for finding me, for protecting us, for giving me a chance to become who I'm supposed to be." Eduardo's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Sarah, I'm the one who should be thanking you. You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever when your mother disappeared: family. Real family, built on love and choice rather than obligation." Emma made a soft cooing sound, and both adults smiled at the pure innocence of it. "Come on," Eduardo said, standing and offering Sarah his arm. "Let's go home and introduce this little angel to her grandmother properly, and then we'll start planning the rest of your lives." As they gathered their things and prepared to leave, Sarah realized that for the first time in her adult life, she was walking toward her future instead of running from her past. The difference felt like the difference between surviving and actually living. The penthouse dining room glowed with warm candlelight as Sarah, Eduardo, and Margaret shared dinner together for the first time in 24 years. The table was set with Eduardo's finest china and crystal, but the atmosphere was intimate rather than formal, a family reunion long overdue. Emma slept peacefully in a bassinet nearby, occasionally making soft baby sounds that drew everyone's attention and filled the silence with gentle wonder. "She's absolutely perfect," Margaret said for what felt like the 100th time, unable to take her eyes off her granddaughter. "She looks exactly like you did as a baby, Sarah, the same delicate features, the same peaceful expression when she sleeps." "Tell me about that," Sarah said gently, settling back in her chair with a cup of herbal tea. "Tell me about when I was born. Tell me about you and Eduardo. I need to understand the whole story." Margaret set down her wineglass and looked across the table at Eduardo, her eyes reflecting decades of regret and love that had never fully died. "Are you sure you want to hear this? Some of it isn't pleasant, and some of it might change how you see both of us. I need to know. Mom, I need to understand why you let me believe you were dead for most of my life. I need to understand what happened between you two that was so terrible it required 24 years of lies." Eduardo reached across the table and took Margaret's hand, a gesture so natural it seemed like they had been holding hands across dinner tables for decades instead of being separated by circumstances and poor choices. "It's all right, Margaret. We're all adults now. The past can't hurt us anymore unless we let it." Margaret took a deep breath, gathering courage from Eduardo's touch. "I was 19 when I met Eduardo. He was 25, in his second year of medical school, working 3 jobs to pay for his education. I was supposed to be focusing on my studies at Barnard, but all I could think about was this brilliant, passionate man who talked about changing the world through medicine." "But you fell in love with the poor medical student instead of the approved suitors," Sarah said, understanding the familiar pattern of family expectations and romantic rebellion. "I fell in love with the most brilliant, ambitious, kind-hearted man I'd ever met." Margaret smiled at Eduardo, and Sarah could see the ghost of the young woman she had been. "He was everything my parents' approved suitors weren't passionate about his work, completely uninterested in my family's money, determined to succeed on his own merits." Eduardo squeezed her hand gently. "You were the most beautiful woman I'd ever seen. But more than that, you were smart, funny, independent. You challenged me to think bigger, to want more than just financial success. You made me believe I could build something meaningful with my life. What happened when you found out I was pregnant?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the broad outlines of the story. Margaret's expression grew sad, weighted with decades of regret. I was terrified. We weren't married. I was still in college, and I knew my parents would be furious. But Eduardo, she looked at him with love that had clearly never faded. Eduardo was thrilled. I wanted to marry you immediately, Eduardo said, his voice filled with the passion of a much younger man. I didn't care about your parents' objections, or their money or their social position. I was ready to drop out of medical school, get a full-time job, support our family however I could. My parents had other ideas. Margaret's voice hardened with remembered anger. They called Eduardo to a meeting at their lawyer's office. I wasn't invited. Of course, women weren't considered capable of handling such important decisions. Sarah looked at her father, seeing shadows of old pain in his eyes. What did they say to you? Eduardo's jaw tightened at the memory. They offered me $50,000 to disappear from your mother's life and never contact her again. When I refused and told them I loved Margaret and wanted to marry her, they explained exactly how they would destroy my medical career before it began. But that's illegal. Legal doesn't matter when you have enough money and influence, Margaret said bitterly. They could have done exactly what they threatened. False accusations of impropriety, destroyed references, blacklisting from every hospital and medical program in the country. They had the power to make sure Eduardo never became a doctor. So you took their money and left, Sarah said, trying to keep judgment out of her voice. I thought I was protecting him. Margaret's eyes filled with tears she had been holding back for decades. I was young and scared, and I believed them when they said Eduardo would be better off without the burden of an unwanted family. So I took their $5,000, not $50,000. They lied about that too, and I disappeared. Eduardo leaned forward, his voice intense with remembered desperation. Margaret, I searched for you for years. Private investigators, newspaper advertisements, every resource I could afford. I spent every spare dollar trying to find you and our child. I changed my name, moved to California, got a job waitressing while I finished my degree at night. Margaret wiped her eyes with her napkin. When you were 3, Sarah, I met James, your stepfather. He was kind, stable, everything I thought you needed, and he never asked questions about your real father. But why did you let me think you were dead? Sarah asked, the question that had been haunting her since Eduardo's revelation. When I was 18, James told me you died in a car accident. He showed me a death certificate. Margaret and Eduardo exchanged glances heavy with shared guilt. Because I asked him to, Margaret said quietly. When you turned 18, I wanted to contact you. I wanted to tell you about Eduardo, about the choices I'd made and why I'd made them. But James convinced me that it would only hurt you. You had a stable life. You were about to start college at Northwestern. You had friends and plans and a future mapped out. James argued that disrupting all of that with the truth about a mother who had abandoned you would be cruel and selfish. So I legally changed my identity when I married James, became Margaret Chen, and let Margaret Thompson officially die in a car accident that never happened. It seemed like the kindest thing to do at the time. Sarah felt overwhelmed by the complexity of it all. My entire life has been built on lies meant to protect me. Not lies, Eduardo said gently. Choices made by people who loved you and wanted to protect you from pain. Wrong choices, maybe, but made with the best intentions by people who were trying to navigate impossible circumstances. Emma stirred in her bassinet, and Sarah automatically reached over to soothe her. The simple act of comforting her daughter, grounding her in the present moment. Whatever mistakes had been made in the past, Emma would grow up knowing the truth about her family. I understand why you made the choices you did, Sarah said slowly, her voice stronger than she felt. But I need you both to promise me something. Anything, Margaret and Eduardo said simultaneously. No more secrets. No more lies. Even well-intentioned ones. Emma deserves to know her family history, all of it. The good, the bad, the complicated parts that don't have easy answers. Agreed, Eduardo said firmly. Completely agreed, Margaret added. No more protecting people from the truth. Truth is better than protection, even when it's painful. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching Emma sleep and processing the weight of revelations that had taken decades to unfold. Finally, Eduardo spoke. Sarah, there's something else. Something I want to discuss with both of you. What is it? I want to officially adopt you. Change your name legally to Sarah Blackwell if you want. I know you're an adult, but I want there to be no question about your place in this family or Emma's inheritance. Sarah felt tears starting again. You want to adopt me? I want to make up for 24 years of missed birthdays, missed Christmas mornings, missed bedtime stories. I want to walk you down the aisle if you ever decide to remarry. I want to spoil Emma rotten and teach her to drive someday and threaten her boyfriends when she's 16. Margaret smiled through her own tears. I think that's beautiful, Eduardo. I think it's what should have happened 24 years ago. What about you? Mom, what are your plans now that we're all back in each other's lives? Margaret looked at Eduardo hopefully, and Sarah could see the young woman she had been peeking through the elegant facade of the woman she had become. Actually, your father and I have been talking about maybe trying again. We're older now, wiser. We both know what it feels like to lose each other, and we don't want to waste whatever time we have left. Sarah looked between her parents. The word felt completely natural now, and saw something she had never thought she would witness: a love story getting a second chance after decades of separation and regret. What do you think, sweetheart? Eduardo asked. Are you ready to have your family back together? All of us, the way it should have been from the beginning. Sarah looked around the table at the people who loved her, then down at Emma sleeping peacefully in her bassinet. For the first time in her life, she felt like she belonged somewhere completely. They say you can't choose your family, but sometimes the universe gives you a second chance to choose the family you deserve. Sometimes the family that finds you is exactly the family you need. I think Emma's going to be the luckiest little girl in the world, she said, her voice filled with wonder and gratitude. She's going to grow up surrounded by people who chose to love each other, even when it was difficult, even when it took 24 years to find their way back to each other. Outside the windows, New York City sparkled with millions of lights, each one representing someone else's story, someone else's family, someone else's journey toward love and belonging. Somewhere out there, Richard was probably nursing his wounds and planning his next move. But here, in this warm room filled with love and possibility, Sarah felt invincible. Her past was complicated, her present was challenging, but her future, their future, was bright with promise and unlimited potential. To new beginning, Eduardo said, raising his wine glass. To family, Margaret added, lifting her own glass. To love that's stronger than fear, Sarah concluded, touching her water glass to theirs. As they toasted, Emma stirred in her sleep and made a soft sound that seemed like approval. The Blackwell family was finally complete. 6 months later, Sarah stood in her office on the 20th floor of the Blackwell Industries building, looking out at Central Park in full autumn splendor. The leaves were turning brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the morning sun made everything look like a painting worthy of the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Mama, Mama, Mama! Emma babbled from her playpen in the corner of the office, her chubby hands reaching for the colorful toys that hung above her head. At 6 months old, she was a happy, healthy baby who had become the unofficial mascot of the Blackwell Foundation and the delight of every employee in the building. Good morning, beautiful girl, Sarah said, scooping Emma up for their morning cuddle ritual. Are you ready for Grandpa's big announcement today? The Blackwell Foundation had thrived under Sarah's leadership in ways that had surprised even Eduardo. In 6 months, she had overseen the distribution of $25 million to causes ranging from domestic violence shelters to children's hospitals to environmental protection programs. More importantly, she had found her calling. Every grant they awarded, every family they helped, felt like a piece of healing for her own past. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Come in, Eduardo entered, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the biggest smile she had seen from him yet. He was dressed in his best suit, and there was an energy about him that suggested something significant was about to happen. Good morning, my girls. How are we this beautiful October morning? We're wonderful, Sarah said, settling Emma on her hip in the practiced motion of an experienced mother. You look like you have news, and knowing you, it's probably news that's going to change our lives again. I do indeed. Eduardo handed her a coffee and gently tweaked Emma's nose, making her giggle with delight. The adoption papers were filed this morning. As of today, you are officially Sarah Margaret Blackwell. And Emma Martinez Blackwell. I wanted her to carry a piece of her heritage from both sides of the family, her Mexican roots and her new future. Sarah felt tears of joy starting. After everything they had been through, after all the legal complications and media attention, it was still hard to believe that the transformation of her life was real and permanent. It's really official. I'm really your daughter in the eyes of the law. You've always been my daughter, sweetheart. Now the law agrees, and no one can ever question your place in this family again. Through the office windows, Sarah could see reporters gathering in the plaza below. Today was the day Eduardo would announce his engagement to Margaret and officially introduce Sarah as his daughter and heir to the Blackwell Empire. The media attention had been intense since the custody battle 6 months ago, but Eduardo's public relations team had managed it brilliantly. "Are you ready for this?" Eduardo asked, following her gaze to the crowd of cameras and reporters. "Once we make the announcement, there will be no going back to your quiet life. You'll be one of the most recognizable women in New York." Sarah considered the question seriously. 6 months ago, she had been a frightened, isolated woman trapped in an abusive marriage with no resources and no hope of escape. Now she was running a multi-million-dollar foundation, had been featured on the cover of Forbes magazine as the philanthropist to watch, and was about to become one of the most powerful women in America. "I'm ready," she said with confidence that surprised even her. "But first, tell me about Richard. How is he handling all of this? Is he staying within the boundaries of the custody agreement?" Eduardo's expression darkened slightly. "He's been compliant. He sees Emma every other weekend as scheduled. Supervised visits only until she's older and can communicate if there are any problems. He's been civil during the exchanges. But he's struggling financially. Lost most of his major investors after the media coverage. Had to sell the Westchester house and downsize his operations significantly. He's living in a modest apartment in Queens now and working on smaller projects." Sarah felt a complicated mix of emotions. She didn't miss Richard or regret leaving him, but she took no pleasure in his downfall either. Will he be okay? Will he be able to rebuild? Eventually, Marcus Gold thinks he'll recover, probably on a smaller scale than before. He's a survivor, Sarah, and he's learned some hard lessons about consequences. He'll find a way to land on his feet, and maybe he'll become a better person in the process. Emma started fussing, and Sarah automatically began the gentle bouncing motion that always calmed her daughter. "Sometimes I wonder if I was too harsh, if I destroyed his life unnecessarily. The divorce settlement was generous, but the business consequences..." Eduardo took Emma from her arms, and the baby immediately settled against his shoulder. He had a natural way with children that made Sarah's heart ache for all the years they had missed together. "Sarah, let me tell you something I've learned in 62 years of life, most of it in business where consequences matter. You are not responsible for the consequences of other people's choices, but if you hadn't left, Emma would be growing up in a house where violence was normal, where love was conditional, where women were treated as property to be controlled rather than people to be respected." Eduardo's voice was firm but gentle. "You didn't destroy Richard's life, sweetheart. You saved your own, and Emma's, and possibly even his, if he's smart enough to learn from what happened." A soft knock interrupted them. Margaret peered around the door, looking radiant in a cream-colored suit that made her silver hair glow like spun platinum. The engagement ring on her finger caught the morning light and sparkled like a promise fulfilled. "Are my favorite people ready for the press conference?" "As ready as we'll ever be," Sarah said, straightening her own outfit, a navy blue dress that struck the perfect balance between professional authority and maternal warmth. "Sarah," Margaret said, moving to embrace her daughter, "I want you to know how proud I am of you, not just for surviving what you went through with Richard, but for thriving, for building something beautiful and meaningful from the ashes of your old life." "I had good teachers," Sarah replied, looking between her parents with gratitude that felt too large for words. "I had people who showed me what real love looks like, what healthy relationships feel like, what it means to be valued for who you are rather than what you can provide." The 3 adults and 1 baby made their way to the elevator that would take them to the press conference. As they descended through the floors of the building that now represented Sarah's future, She thought about the journey that had brought them all to this moment. The elevator doors opened to reveal a room full of reporters, cameras, and bright lights. Sarah took a deep breath, lifted her chin with the confidence she had learned from her father, and stepped into her new life as a public figure. "Ladies and gentlemen," Eduardo began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to commanding attention, "I'd like you to meet my daughter, Sarah Blackwell, and my granddaughter, Emma. They are the future of the Blackwell family and the Blackwell Foundation." As the cameras flashed and the questions began, Sarah felt Emma's tiny hand grab her finger. She looked down at her daughter's perfect face and made a silent promise that would guide every decision she made for the rest of her life. Emma would grow up knowing she was loved unconditionally. She would never doubt her worth, never accept less than she deserved, never be afraid to use her voice or stand up for herself. She would grow up strong, confident, and surrounded by family who chose each other every single day. The press conference lasted an hour, but Sarah barely noticed the time passing. She answered questions about the foundation's work, about her unexpected reunion with Eduardo, about her plans for expanding their charitable efforts. She spoke with confidence and grace, every inch the philanthropist and heiress she had become. When it was over, the family retreated to Eduardo's office for a moment of quiet celebration and reflection. "That went perfectly," Margaret said, settling into a chair with Emma on her lap. "You were magnificent, Sarah, natural and authoritative, and completely comfortable in your own skin." "I felt magnificent," Sarah admitted, still marveling at the transformation. "6 months ago, I could barely order coffee without apologizing for taking up the barista's time. Today I announced a $50 million initiative to support domestic violence survivors and their children." Eduardo opened a bottle of champagne that had been waiting in his office refrigerator. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his glass in a toast. "To family," Margaret added, lifting her own glass. "To love that's stronger than fear," Sarah concluded, touching her water glass to theirs. As they clinked glasses, Emma clapped her tiny hands together, making them all laugh with pure joy. The sound echoed through the office like a benediction. Through the windows, New York City stretched out below them, full of possibility and promise. Sarah had found her place in the world, her purpose, her family. She had found herself. The scared woman who had been slapped in a hospital delivery room was gone forever, replaced by Sarah Blackwell, daughter, mother, philanthropist, survivor. A woman who had learned that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing that ever happens to you. Outside, autumn was painting the world in brilliant colors, and inside, a family that had been broken was finally whole again. The future had never looked brighter, and Sarah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The millionaire ex-husband who had tried to control her was just a chapter in her story now, not the author of her destiny. The divorce settlement had given her financial independence, but more importantly, she had discovered her own strength, her own worth, her own power to create the life she wanted. Women supporting women, she thought, remembering all the people who had helped her along the way, the nurses in the delivery room, Margaret's strategic use of her social connections, the female reporters who had told her story with compassion and accuracy. As Emma fell asleep in Margaret's arms and Eduardo began planning their next charitable initiative, Sarah realized that her midlife transformation was complete. She had not just escaped from an abusive marriage, she had stepped into her destiny as a powerful woman capable of changing the world. The Blackwell legacy would continue through Emma, but it would be shaped by Sarah's values of compassion, justice, and the fierce protection of those who couldn't protect themselves. It was a legacy worth building, a future worth fighting for, and a life worth living with complete authenticity and joy. The scared girl who had once believed she deserved nothing had become a woman who knew she deserved everything: love, respect, purpose, and the freedom to choose her own path. And she would make sure Emma grew up knowing the same truth about her own unlimited potential.